Hello, my name is Jamie Pytlik, and I'm a BSW student in the social work program at Tarleton, class of May 2020. In September of 2018, I began an independent research project under the mentorship of Dr. Hall. My research is over alleviating barriers to justice for sexual violence survivors. This video will provide an overview of the independent study course I completed with Dr. Hall in summer of 2019 and a presentation of my research. I took my independent study course in summer of 2019, and it was a 12-week course. Prior to the start of the summer semester, Dr. Hall and I worked together to design the course by creating the syllabus, developing assignments, and establishing the objectives and expectations for the course. The purpose of this course was to assist me in the development of my research over sexual violence, and we did this through literature review, updated data analysis, undergraduate journal selection and submission, and preparation for upcoming conferences and research presentations. My assignments included identification of undergraduate journals for me to submit both my research paper and my policy paper, which I completed in the social welfare policy class I took in spring 2019. My research paper was submitted to the Journal of Integrated Social Sciences, which is a journal that specializes in publishing research over social phenomena. My policy paper was submitted to the Journal of Undergraduate Research in Scholarly Excellence. I also completed an updated data analysis to identify additional codes, categories, and themes among the 12 sources I analyzed for my research. I completed 2 drafts of my research paper, which eventually became the final draft I submitted to the Journal of Integrated Social Sciences for publication. I completed supplemental readings of 2 books. The first book was Sex Crimes Then and Now, My Life on the Front Lines, Prosecuting Rapists and Confronting Their Collaborators. This is a book that was written by a former sex crimes prosecutor in New York City. And then the second book I read was called Criminal Investigations of Sex Trafficking. Lastly, I completed a final presentation video using Zoom. Now I'm going to present my research over sexual violence. The information in this presentation can be emotionally triggering for some individuals. If you experience an emotional response, you can contact the Tarleton Student Counseling Center, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN hotline, or the National Human Trafficking Hotline for resources and support. In previous years, sexual violence has occurred rapidly, but little was done to address this issue. However, the Me Too movement gained popularity in the last couple of years, thus providing a platform for survivors to share their stories, and the media provided sex trafficking with increased attention. As a result, injustices that survivors face due to these crimes have been highlighted and provided a context for how these issues can be addressed by both social workers and other professionals in the future. Survivors of sexual violence are often failed by the criminal justice system. This study uses a systematic review process of 12 sources to inform future research on the issue of sexual violence and to evaluate the criminal justice system in addressing these types of crimes and working with survivors. This research includes important key terms. The first key term, sexual violence, is an umbrella term that refers to sexual acts that are committed without a person's consent, and sexual violence often includes force, coercion, or other means to compel the person into engaging into the act. Sexual assault is a form of sexual violence, and it refers to sexual contact or behavior that occurs without consent from the victim. Rape is a specific type of sexual assault that refers specifically to sexual penetration without the victim's consent. Sex trafficking is a form of modern slavery that exists all over the world. In sex trafficking, traffickers will use violence, threats, coercion, or other means to compel both children and adults into performing commercial sex acts. A rape kit is an invasive exam that's performed after a sexual assault takes place. This exam usually takes 4 to 6 hours to complete, and it is an attempt to locate DNA evidence on the victim or survivor's body. The rape kit backlog refers to all of the rape kits, hundreds of thousands of them, that are stored in police evidence storage facilities or crime labs across the country untested. Lastly, the term trauma bonding refers to a psychological state where victims become increasingly attached to their abuser. This is common in sex trafficking victims and causes loyalty to their trafficker and a likelihood to return to their trafficker when given the opportunity to do so. Some important facts and statistics regarding sexual violence came from various sources. From the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, for every 1,000 sexual assaults that occurs, only 310 are reported to the police, only 57 will lead to arrest of the perpetrator, only 11 are referred to prosecutors, only 7 will result in a felony conviction, and only 6 of the 1,000 offenders will serve time in prison. Also, according to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men will be the victim of an attempted or completed sexual assault in their lifetime. Also, according to a law review I analyzed as a part of my research, instances of false reports typically range between 2 and 8%. However, many law enforcement officials have the misconception that at least 50% of sexual assault allegations are false. Now, according to the Polaris Project, which is an organization that studies human trafficking patterns and provides services to victims, human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise, and approximately 24.9 million people are enslaved around the world. And from the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, approximately 25,000 of the reports of runaway children they receive each year, 1 in 7 of the individuals reported are suspected victims of child sex trafficking. And lastly, in the state of Texas alone, approximately 284,000 victims of human trafficking are in the state at any given time, and this is according to the Attorney General's Office of Texas. The purpose of this research was to analyze and describe obstacles that sexual violence survivors encounter when they report their abuse in the criminal justice system. This research also intends to evaluate the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in addressing sexual violence and meeting the needs of survivors. Lastly, this research intends to inform future research and social work practice on sexual violence and to provide additional knowledge for both direct practice efforts and advocacy efforts for sexual violence survivors. The research question I developed for this research was, what types of challenges do survivors of sexual violence face when they choose to come forward regarding their abuse in the criminal justice system? I had 3 prior expectations for my research outcomes. The first was that sex trafficking would be generalized with other forms of sexual violence. The next was that law enforcement officers would be aware of common myths and misconceptions regarding sexual violence, and as a result, would not allow these myths and misconceptions to impact the way that they investigate these crimes. My last prior expectation was that barriers to justice for sexual violence survivors would be prevalent in the criminal justice system. I have 3 learning objectives for this research. The first was that I would identify obstacles survivors of sexual violence encounter when they report their abuse in the criminal justice system and choose to navigate this channel. The second was to identify and understand the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in dealing with these types of crimes and in meeting survivor needs. And the third was to identify and understand implications for social work practice at the micro, meso, and macro level. I used the ecological systems theory to inform the study. The ecological systems theory was developed by Bronfenbrenner in 1979, and it recognizes that individuals are influenced by every aspect of their environment and that they interact in various different systems, and they must be viewed in the context of these systems in order to be effectively served. In the case of sexual violence, survivors interact in a microsystem, which includes the survivor's family and friends and immediate support network. They interact with a mesosystem, which refers to criminal justice system officials that interact directly with the survivor, such as patrol officers, detectives, and prosecutors. The exosystem refers to members of the legal system who don't interact with the survivor directly, but they still impact the survivor's experience and the outcome of their case. An example of these individuals would be jury members and judges. The macro system refers to the creation of policies that impact the survivor's access to justice. And then lastly, the chronosystem refers to the impact that the trauma the survivor experience will have on the rest of their lifetime. This theory informs the study by acknowledging the importance of viewing sexual violence survivors in the context of all of these systems they interact with, rather than just viewing them in the context of one. I created a systematic review process of 12 sources to complete this study. I reviewed a total of 12 sources. 3 of these sources were documentaries, 7 were journal articles or reports, and 2 were organizations. I provided an overview of each source and identified the overall results or findings for these sources. I utilized Hahn's coding process to identify codes, categories, and themes. I identified 719 codes, and the codes refer to important keywords, concepts, or ideas that were present in the sources. These codes were collapsed into 21 categories, and these 21 categories were then put into 4 different themes. The 4 themes were trafficking, institutional reform, procedural shortcomings, and victim experiences. Next, I'm going to provide an overview of my sources. I'm going to start with journal articles and reports. I reviewed a total of 7 journal articles and reports. Their publication dates ranged from 2013 to 2018. The first source was titled Unearthed Concepts of Justice for Women Who Have Experienced Sexual Violence, Possibilities for Healing and Enhancing Criminal Justice. This source was 5 pages long. This source had the idea that the criminal justice system is often not effective in obtaining justice for survivors of sexual violence because conventional ideas of justice, such as punishment and punitive measures, do not uphold the ideas of justice that many survivors possessed. This source suggested the idea of a therapeutic approach to justice for survivors of sexual violence. The findings of this source included the idea that the therapeutic approach would eliminate many of the factors in the criminal justice system that further victimize survivors and impair their healing process. The therapeutic approach would provide survivors with validation for the crime, accountability from the perpetrator, recognition of the seriousness of the crime, protection and prevention from others instead of harsh punishment for the offender, and therefore these ideals would hold up the ideas of justice that many survivors possess that aren't currently present in the criminal justice system. Overall, this source found that applying new concepts of justice in sexual violence cases can give survivors a better opportunity at attaining true justice. This source generated a total of 39 codes. These 39 codes supported 6 categories, and these 6 categories were put into 2 themes. Overall, this source supported 2 themes, institutional reform and victim experiences. The next source was titled Tested at Last, How DNA Evidence in Untested Rape Kits Can Identify Offenders in Serial Sexual Assaults. This source was 23 pages long, and it was a study that was conducted in Detroit, Michigan, to test untested sexual assault evidence kits or rape kits to determine the utility of DNA evidence in both stranger sexual assault cases and non-stranger sexual assault cases. A stranger sexual assault case refers to a sexual assault that is perpetrated by someone the victim does not know, and a non-stranger sexual assault case refers to a sexual assault that is perpetrated by someone the victim does know, such as a friend, a boyfriend, a significant other, or a date. The findings of this study indicated that of the 900 untested rape kits that were tested in this study, multiple matches with DNA that was already in the CODIS database were generated. This study also revealed that DNA evidence can be beneficial in both stranger and non-stranger sexual assault cases because the DNA evidence in rape kits can identify stranger offenders, it can generate patterns of serial sexual assaults, and it can affirm a survivor's account of their abuse with additional information from previous cases. This source generated a total of 54 codes. These codes were put into 8 different categories, and overall, this source supported 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. The third journal article I reviewed was called Sex Trafficking in the U.S., a closer look at United States citizen victims. This source was 10 pages long, and it was completed by the Polaris Project, which is an organization that studies human trafficking patterns and works to provide victim services and prevention. This source had important key findings that included the risk factors that made survivors vulnerable to sex trafficking. For example, a risk factor for sex trafficking is homeless or runaway youth because they become vulnerable targets to manipulative traffickers. This source also indicated key locations where sex trafficking generally occurs, such as tracks within cities, hotels, and residential areas. This source also indicated the types of relationships survivors often have with their traffickers, such as a romantic relationship or employer-employee relationship. This source also indicated how many sex trafficking victims engaged with parties that could have assisted, such as law enforcement or healthcare providers. This source generated a total of 122 codes, which supported 12 categories. Overall, this source supported 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and trafficking. My 4th journal article I reviewed was titled Assessment Exploring Impediments to Successful Prosecutions of Sex Traffickers. This source was 15 pages long. In this study, researchers interviewed various criminal justice professionals regarding child sex trafficking and barriers to successfully prosecuting these cases. The overall findings of this study indicated that child sex trafficking cases are difficult to prosecute because survivors often do not identify themselves as victims. They may be misidentified as juvenile delinquents and arrested rather than treated as victims in need of support. And they often experience trauma bonding with their trafficker, meaning that they develop a strong psychological attachment to their trafficker and as a result experience loyalty and a tendency to return to their trafficker when given the opportunity to do so. This source generated a total of 50 codes. These 50 codes were divided up into 14 different categories, and this source supported all 4 of the themes. The next journal article I reviewed was Perceptions of Criminal Justice Responses to Sexual Violence. This source was 21 pages long. It was a study over police perceptions of how the criminal justice system responds to sexual violence. The overall findings of this source indicated 4 themes: police perceptions, trial shortcomings, victim support, and victim blaming. Overall, this source indicated that the court system is often too heavy-handed and outdated to effectively prosecute these types of crimes and meet the needs of survivors. Also, this source indicated that not enough resources are available for survivors to get the support they need and the help with healing from the trauma they experienced. Overall, this source generated a total of 76 codes. These 76 codes supported 13 categories, and overall, this source supported a total of 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. My next journal article was titled Incredible Women, Sexual Violence and the Credibility Discount. This source was actually a law review, and it was 58 pages long. This source examined how discrediting women who are survivors of sexual assault can affect their access to justice. Credibility is important in sexual violence cases, as many sexual assault cases are he said, she said, which causes credibility to become much more important because it's one person's word against another's. The overall finding of this source indicated that there are many requirements that are necessary for corroboration that are outdated and unrealistic in comparison to what research shows about sexual violence. Also, this source indicated that various misconceptions and prejudices often cause credibility discounting. Also, this source indicated that misconceptions about statistics on false reporting play a role in credibility discounting. This source actually indicated the statistic that was shared earlier on in the presentation, stating that while false accusation statistics are usually around 2 to 8%, many law enforcement officers believe that false accusation reports are closer to 50%. Lastly, this source indicated that credibility discounting often occurs in a failure to believe and understand victims and how their cases relate to the law. This source generated a total of 86 codes. These 86 codes supported 9 categories, and overall, this source supported a total of 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. Lastly, my next journal article is Police in Domestic Sex Trafficking of Youth: What Teens Can Tell Us That Can Aid in Prevention and Interdiction. This source was 18 pages long. It indicated that police interactions can help teenagers who are victims of sex trafficking because youth are affected by police interactions on various levels. The overall findings demonstrated the 3 themes: that many high-risk youth fear the police and therefore avoid police contact, which causes them, even if they are being victimized, to avoid reporting to the police. This source also indicated that police responses to domestic violence often increase teens' risk of entering sex trafficking. And lastly, it indicated the theme that police interactions can facilitate trafficking entry or miss opportunities for intervention. This relates to the idea that police officers often do not have the necessary training to identify victims of trafficking and to be able to work with them effectively to investigate these cases. Overall, this source generated a total of 120 codes. These 120 codes supported 14 categories, and overall, this source supported all 4 themes. Next, I'm going to provide an overview of the documentaries I reviewed. I reviewed a total of 3 documentaries. One was created in 2015, and the other were created in 2017. The first documentary was titled I Am Evidence. It was 86 minutes long, and it focused on the rape kit backlog by telling the stories of women who were sexually assaulted and did not have their rape kits tested. One of the survivors whose stories were documented could have had her assault prevented if a prior survivor's kit had been tested, as they were assaulted by the same offender. One survivor's kit was finally tested, and the offender was not only identified, but he was also tried and convicted. The last survivor's kit was tested, a DNA match was found, and the offender went to trial, but he was acquitted. The overall findings of this source indicated that Detroit, Michigan alone located over 10,000 untested rape kits. They used an initiative to test all of the rape kits, and they identified approximately 770 serial offenders. This source generated a total of 47 codes. The 47 codes were put into 11 different categories. Overall, this source supported a total of 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. The next documentary was titled I Am Jane Doe. It was 98 minutes long, and it documented the experiences of 2 girls who were sold into sex trafficking. The 2 girls were 13 and 15 years old, and they ran away from home and ended up being sold on Backpage.com for sex. When the girls were located and returned home, their parents pursued legal action against Backpage.com and learned that the website actually gives discrete instructions on how users can post ads without displaying that the ads are promoting criminal activity. When going through the legal action against Backpage.com, the girls' parents learned that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act states that website providers such as Backpage.com are not responsible for the content posted by third-party users, even if that content promotes criminal activity. The overall findings of this source indicated civil suits against Backpage.com and proceedings in Congress to address issues of sex trafficking. Overall, this source generated a total of 50 codes. The 50 codes supported 9 categories, and the source supported a total of 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and trafficking. My last documentary was titled The Hunting Ground. It was 103 minutes long, and it detailed the campus sexual assault epidemic, as sexual assault occurs on college campuses at astonishing rates. In this documentary, various survivors told their stories, and almost none of the perpetrators ever faced consequences for the crimes they committed. Colleges would convince survivors to report to the school rather than to the police, and as a result, this allowed the schools to keep their numbers regarding sexual assault as low as possible. This documentary also explored sexual assaults that occurred at fraternities and sexual assaults committed by student athletes. It also detailed a Title IX investigation that survivors on various college campuses invoked to improve the Title IX programs at their schools. Overall, this documentary generated a total of 24 codes. The 24 codes supported 11 different categories, and overall, this source supported 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. Lastly, I'm going to provide an overview of my organizations I reviewed. I reviewed 2 organizations, the Joyful Heart Foundation and the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. The Joyful Heart Foundation was established in 2004 with a mission to change the way that society views crimes such as sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. This foundation also intends to support survivors' healing and to use advocacy efforts to end this type of violence. The overall findings of this source indicated an initiative called End the Backlog, which was created by the Joyful Heart Foundation to address the rape kit backlog. This initiative indicated that many rape kits are often never tested and are instead stored in police evidence facilities or crime labs. As a result, thousands of women never receive justice. This source generated a total of 33 codes. These 33 codes supported 9 different categories, and overall, this source supported 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. The last organization was titled the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN. RAIN was established in 1994. It had the mission of preventing sexual violence, supporting survivors, and ensuring that offenders are held accountable. In addition to this mission, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network manages a sexual assault hotline, which was provided earlier in the presentation for support in case of emotional responses. And this organization also aids various other organizations and agencies across the country. One notable organization that RAIN supports is the United States Department of Defense. The overall findings of this source indicated that the majority of perpetrators of sexual violence will not serve jail time. Also indicated that sexual violence is extremely underreported and that survivors often do not report because they fear retaliation, they feel that the police cannot help them or will not help them, they feel that their assault was a personal matter and they don't want to get the perpetrator in trouble, they may report it to a different official, such as a Title IX office on a college campus, or they believe that their case was not important enough to report. Overall, this source generated a total of 13 codes. These 13 codes supported 3 categories, which supported 3 themes: institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. The results of this study generated 4 themes: trafficking, institutional reform, victim experiences, and procedural shortcomings. The first theme was trafficking. Trafficking was composed of 4 different categories. The first category, risk factors, had a total of 75 codes in the category. The second category, trafficking manipulation tactics, had 75 codes in the category. The dynamics of trafficking category had 29 codes in the category. And lastly, the characteristics of trafficking had 3 codes in the category. As you can tell, the risk factors and trafficking manipulation tactics made up 41% each of the theme. The dynamics of trafficking made up 16% of the theme, and the characteristics of traffickers made up 2% of this theme. The second theme, institutional reform, was made up of 8 different categories. The first category, lack of resources, had 33 codes in the category. The next category, lack of knowledge, had 25 codes in the category. The third category, potential solutions, had 84 codes in the category. The institutional shortcomings category had 51 codes, and the benefits of testing rape kits had 54 codes. The societal misconceptions category had 18 codes. The explanations for untested rape kits had 21 codes, and social injustices had a total of 4 codes. As you can tell, the potential solutions made up 29% of the institutional reform theme. The institutional shortcomings made up 18% of the institutional reform theme. The benefits of testing rape kits made up 19% of the institutional reform theme. Societal misconceptions made up 6% of the institutional reform theme. Explanations for untested rape kits made up 7% of the theme. Social injustices made up 1% of the theme. Lack of knowledge made up 11% of the theme. And potential solutions made up 9% of the theme. The next theme was victim experiences. It had a total of 4 categories. Needs of victims had 17 codes in the category, and it made up a total of 44% of the theme. Expectations of victims had 12 codes in the category, and it made up 21% of the theme. Treatment of the victims had 35 codes in the category, and it made up 15% of the theme, and aftermath of sexual victimization had 16 codes in its category, and it made up 20% theme. The last theme, procedural shortcomings, was composed of 5 categories. Judicial barriers was one of the categories, and it had 45 codes. Barriers to victim cooperation had 28 codes. Investigative shortcomings had 53 codes. Barriers to reporting had 9 codes, and misconceptions regarding credibility had 28 codes. Judicial barriers made up 28% of this theme. Investigative shortcomings made up 32% of this theme. Misconceptions of credibility made up 17% of this theme. Barriers to reporting made up 6% of this theme. And barriers to cooperation made up 17% of this theme. In addition to my overall research, I also completed a policy analysis that related to my research. I completed this policy analysis in the social welfare policy class I took in spring of 2019. My policy analysis was over the Put Trafficking Victims First Act of 2019, which is House of Representatives Bill 507. This bill was introduced in Congress in January of 2019. It passed the House vote almost unanimously, with only one person voting against it, and it was referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee in February of 2019. This legislation intends to implement a more victim-centered approach to issues surrounding human trafficking. These approaches would include additional trainings for law enforcement officers to more effectively identify and investigate cases. It would cause improved prosecutions of traffickers. It would require the Attorney General to report on restitution efforts for victims of trafficking. It would generate the development of new research methodologies to more accurately assess the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States. And it would encourage states to expand their services for victims of trafficking. To complete this policy analysis, I conducted a literature review of 9 sources. The policy analysis was submitted to the Journal of Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Excellence for potential publication. In addition to my research and my policy analysis, I also completed supplemental readings of 2 books as a part of the independent study course. The first book was titled Sex Crimes Then and Now: My Years on the Front Lines Prosecuting Rapists and Confronting Their Collaborators. And the second book was titled Criminal Investigations of Sex Trafficking in America. The first book, Sex Crimes Then and Now, was written by Alice Bacchus, a former chief of the Special Victims Unit of the Queens County DA's office in New York City. Bacchus had a very strong career as a sex crime prosecutor. In addition to working in the Queens County DA's office, she also worked in Lincoln County in Oregon as a sex crimes prosecutor as well. Sex Crimes describes Bacchus' experiences as a prosecutor of sexual violence, mainly in New York City. It provided key information on important cases that she prosecuted during her career. So, for example, a case that I thought was the most interesting that she discussed was a case that she prosecuted in New York, and it was a case of incest of a young woman who had been sexually assaulted by her father starting in her childhood and continuing all the way into her 30s. This case was really interesting to me because it confirmed a lot of the research that I had done, because the book indicated that this victim did not experience a lot of the behaviors that we as a society would expect her to exhibit due to the trauma she endured. Instead, she was almost emotionless throughout the entire process, is how Bacchus described the experience. In addition to providing key narratives on certain cases, this book also described how prosecutions of sex crimes have changed since the height of the author's career in the 1970s to now. It also explained the role of politics in prosecuting sex crimes, and it had the idea that offenders aren't the only enemies when prosecuting sex crimes. Instead, there's also many powerful individuals such as judges, defense attorneys, and even law enforcement officers that often will choose to protect offenders rather than support victims. Something really interesting at the end of this book is the author revealed that she actually lost her job prosecuting sex crimes because she refused to be complacent in a certain case, and she refused to enable someone to be able to escape consequences for a crime they committed. And as a result, she lost her job. And at the end of the book, she indicates that as a sex crimes prosecutor, the only way to change the culture is to be willing to be fired. And this really showed her dedication to her, not her career necessarily, but to the cause that she was working on. The next book, Criminal Investigations of Sex Trafficking in America, was written by Leonard Tirito, who is a criminal justice professor at St. Leo University, and Natalia Glover, who is also an adjunct professor at St. Leo University in the Criminal Justice Department. Both these individuals have experiences with sex trafficking, and Leonard Tirito was actually a law enforcement officer in Florida around the time that Ted Bundy was arrested, tried, and convicted of the Chi Omega murders that occurred in the 1970s. This book provided a comprehensive overview of sex trafficking and its various components. It starts off by giving an overview of sex trafficking, definitions of the crime and other crimes that are related to it, and a historical overview of how the crime has progressed throughout the years. It also provides information on current laws and policies, such as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the Mann Act of 1910, and the significance of U visas and T visas and human trafficking investigations. It gives information on different types of trafficking that occur in the United States, such as domestic sex trafficking of children and the sex trafficking of foreign women and children into the United States. It also explains the John factor, which refers to the factor of the individuals who are purchasing sex from people who are being victimized by sex trafficking, but who are not the ones who are actually selling these individuals for sex. It also explains child sex tourism, which is another form of the commercial sex trade. And then it provides information on the interrogation, crime scene investigation, and prosecution components of sex trafficking in the United States. And then lastly, it provides information on multi-agency task force, which are used to effectively investigate sex trafficking in the United States. I personally found the prosecutions chapter to be the most interesting because I hope to pursue a career as a sex crimes prosecutor, and I would like to hopefully prosecute sex trafficking cases. And as a result, this chapter provided me with a lot of information and insight on what this career looks like and the responsibilities of a sex trafficking prosecutor. Overall, this research study and this course had multiple implications for social work. At the micro level, improved relationships with survivors can help build trust and account for the trauma that they've experienced. At the meso level, ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable, law enforcement officers receive the proper education so that they are not swayed by myths and misconceptions, and they understand trauma, can help improve survivors' interactions at the meso level with individuals they interact with. And then lastly, at the macro level, alternative forms of justice could be implemented to provide survivors with a better semblance of justice. Reformed legislation could be enacted to better support survivor needs, end the rape kit backlog, and to create more comprehensive sex trafficking policies. And then also at the macro level, social workers can work to change biases and misconceptions within society regarding sexual violence. Lastly, these are my references. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned a lot about sexual violence.